started. And we've got 2 questions in the Q&A. So I think the first question is for Kate. So how do you know when an other duty as assigned turns into a project, and how can you begin to advocate for yourself as a project manager? Are there common indicators for which we should look to identify new or recurring responsibilities that should be redefined as a project? And if other presenters have thoughts on this too, please chime in.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that I tend to think about this is that, projects are supposed to have like a finite, complete end date, right? There is some objective that's supposed to be completed at the end of the project. What I find ends up happening in library land is that very few of our projects ever actually end all the way, right? Like I have a collection that we launched 6 years ago where we still have outstanding tickets because we have not updated very, very specific metadata that would only be useful to very specific personnel in our organization, but it's still not done, right? I would also say that one of the other key aspects of being able to identify when it becomes a project is at the point where you are being asked to engage with and coordinate the work of a lot of different people that you may not necessarily have managerial control over, like yourself. Okay, so my feeling is that once you're being asked to coordinate across multiple groups or multiple individuals in different areas, that frequently is when it becomes like a project and not just a duty. That's the way that I would think about it. When it comes to like advocating for yourself as a project manager, that one's also really sticky because like I talked about, and something that I've seen routinely and experience is, we scatter a lot of project management responsibilities across personnel with existing areas of expertise and existing day jobs, and then are consequently not giving them the actual hours to articulate my job as project management. And when I say that and those hours, I'm thinking in particular of the training and training and hours requirements for like Scrum certification or PMCP certification. Right. I see a lot of like, oh yeah, the project that never ends. Like that's, yeah, going on in chat. I definitely had those experiences. So what I would say is when it comes to advocacy, I'm trying to be thoughtful about this, or self-advocacy. I would say starting to, articulate, these are the actual activities that I'm doing, right? I think that we often get really caught up in project management as this sort of like nebulous, know it when you see it type of thing, right? You know that you're managing project because suddenly you're managing project. I think that decomposing it a bit into like the concrete skills that you're using, right? And the concrete activities that you're using. And it's not just a loosey-goosey feminized labor type of thing, right? Where you're managing relationships and stakeholders, but like, no, I'm generating documentation and I'm doing check-ins with these personnel and I am, doing and coordinating like whatever needs to be coordinated. I think that that's the point where you can start to say, I'm doing project management, not just been handed this task, so.
Other presenters, do any of you want to chime in on this one? All right, then we'll go on to the next question. We've got some really good questions here. So I'm going to start with the one that has 2 upvotes right now. Any advice on how, I think this is for Megan, but I think again, anyone can chime in on this one. Any advice on how to proceed with very divided policy feedback from our patrons? For example, some of our students are calling for less policing on campus, while some students, mostly in response to recent incidents in our large urban university, are calling for an increase of security. The library receives complaints on both sides about our security policies. It's difficult to find ways to make students with both perspectives feel safe. So real. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Policing in the library is something. And actually, I'll say that one of the initial reasons that I started looking at the code of conduct in my library and talking about this issue is realizing how inconsistently the police were called and for what reasons in my library. So I'm not sure I can fully answer the question around the sort of specific example, but in general, I think you're always going to have user disagreement about these things. And I think the more you can then attend to what your professional values are, what your library's values are, and connect the policy language and decisions that you make to those values, be transparent about that, and provide ways for students to appeal certain things. And I think also when you re-review a policy in the future, consider what exceptions to that policy have been made, and if that maybe indicates that the policy then needs to be revised. But overall, I think policies should be living documents, and based on how they're implemented, how they work in our own social environments, they need to be continuously revised and improved.
Awesome. I love that idea of them being living documents and not just something that we set and forget and enforce. That's a really great suggestion. All right, we've got 2 more questions here. So first, for Kate and Nicholas, have you read Miriam Posner's recent article on Agile? And if so, what do you think about it?
So I did read the article. I thought it was a good read, and I had it very much in mind when I was going through the slides and going through the presentation. I would say one of the things that really resonated with me about the article was this discussion of sort of the Agile industrial complex, and kind of the, like I alluded to this towards the end of the presentation, this paradox between the kind of original motivating anarchic spirit of Agile, and then how it's come to be kind of implemented in practice, sort of very much reified and structured with this whole sort of industry around it. And I think that's one of the tensions in our Agile transformation that I feel somewhat ambivalent about, because like the origin of this Agile transformation effort was very much sort of top-down driven. We had a notion based on feedback and conversations with staff of some of the challenges that we were trying to solve, some of the ways in which we wanted to change the culture. And we picked up on Agile as a potential tool for doing that. But it wasn't like, there was a groundswell movement among the staff saying like, what we really need is Agile. So I think kind of where we're at now is like, for us collectively to come to a good enough understanding of like how Agile is supposed to work in its pure form, to then be able to feel confident and kind of riffing on it or improvising on it, discarding some of its orthodoxies and rituals and artifacts to make something that more legitimately works for our context and for the nature of our work, given that Agile was originally conceived as something for work very different than some of the kinds of work that we do.
Yeah, so I also have read it. I actually included it in my list of citations, but I know that it's tiny and was on screen for like 5 seconds. But one thing that I always value about Miriam Posner's work is I feel like she does a very good job of illuminating what the power lines are within any given structure. And I feel like she really illuminated a number of the ways in which, again, like I will say this repeatedly, I work pretty heavily in this type of project management method myself as an IT manager, right? But thinking very critically about who has power and who doesn't within those circumstances, right? And how some of the practices and methodologies serve to disenfranchise people in a variety of different ways, right? And I think that is really critical to, a lot of where my thinking is around Agile, and with my own presentation is I am always very interested in questions of power, right? And thinking through carefully, like who has power and who doesn't, and who gets to define what you do and what you don't. And I was even thinking about this in terms of like who gets to be identified as a project manager. And I think that's difficult to extricate from a largely feminized workforce, like who's doing what level of activities and what the shape of that tends to be. So those were things that I was thinking about with that article. And yeah, it's informing what I think is working towards like some of my broader argument as well about, managerialism in our library organizations and how that can manifest as what I think is frequently like a misapplied project management methodology. The other thing is like, I was fortunate enough to like learn project management from like a kind of old school engineer. But like shortly after Agile came out, and I came out of it with this idea that like Agile is a manifesto, and nowhere in that manifesto do you find things like, all of the terminology and the syntax and the industrialization around Agile. And I find that oftentimes the work that Agile manifesto outlines doesn't necessarily align to all of the process that's been applied around it, right? That gets back to, I think, a lot of skills around emotional labor and around communication that maybe don't matriculate quite as well as standing up that Trello board, man.
Terrific. Thank you for those thoughtful comments. And if someone hasn't added this to the resources document, please, I invite you to do so. And then we have one more question from Scout in the Q&A, which is acknowledged as a hard question to answer on the fly, but I'm gonna ask it for you anyway. So what if Megan and Kate shared an approach? What would policy discourse embedded in Trello or project management or PM discourse or Agile look like?
This is a hard question. I think, I mean, I would have to think about that a bit, but I think a lot of times the language of project management, some of the discourses that might emerge from that are things like efficiency and productivity and sort of capitalistic goals of worker production. And so I think an awareness around that and challenging some of that rhetoric could be beneficial to the process, which, Kate, I think you've pointed to some of those things in your discussions about power and project management.
Yeah, that is hard to answer on the fly. It's really thoughtful though, and I think that it's a good theoretical question to dive into a bit. I tend to think the same way. I've been toying with this idea of like, what does project management look like under more of like a feminist framework? Because I think that right now it is, as I've kind of alluded to, like, we're spelled out. I think it's very managerialist in a lot of its approach. I think that it's hard to extricate managerialism from neoliberalism and like broader discussions of like the institution in that regard. And I am not necessarily equipped to wade into that part of the conversation like right now with 2 minutes, but yeah, those I think are like good analytical frameworks that, Megan described, right? So like, do you see a lot of emphasis on like efficiencies? Do you see a lot of emphasis on like output and product and all of that? And again, I'm like, oh, I work like this. This is kind of how I do things. And I'm like, ooh, what would it take to actually reframe a lot of the discourse and the narrative about that work, right? And what would it take to embrace a more feminist methodology? And I'd say feminist methodology because that's often like where my praxis kind of is, but yeah.
I think y'all did a really nice job of trying to answer that question on the fly. Thank you. And since we have 4 minutes left, Annie, I personally have a question for you. So I'm going to ask my question since I have the mic. So I love your idea of sharing more out about library work on social media. And one challenge that I consistently see is trying to find where our users actually are on social media and feeling like we're chasing right behind them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a question for your communications team, but like I said, I mean, how effective social media will be it really depends on your library and what kind of engagement you're already seeing. I try personally, like follow who other people are following, really try to get in there, and don't, obviously, I mean, I think the golden rule with Twitter and other social media is don't just post, but respond as well too, to try to build that kind of engagement among your users. And then hopefully when you do post things about your staff, you'll see more engagement back. But it's definitely part of a bigger process and part of a bigger question that your library has to think about. What's the purpose of social media? How are we using social media? Who is our target audience? Yeah, big questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love that idea of making sure to engage back. Great suggestion. Well, that brings us to the end of our first round of lightning talks. So thank you again to all of our presenters. This was a really fascinating conversation, really excellent lightning talks. Appreciate them. To our colleagues here in the audience, as Rebecca has said in the chat, you're going to get a link to the survey about this. We really hope that you'll respond and let us know what you think, because we do take those comments seriously as we plan our next conference. And we will be putting the lightning talks up and this video as soon as possible, hopefully by this evening, so that you can share them out with your colleagues while they're still top of mind for you. So thanks again to everyone for being here, and a special thanks to our presenters. With that, I will turn off the recording.